Hello everyone, and welcome to the 7th seminar of the Contemporary Women's Writing and Medical Humanities online seminar series, organised with the support of the Centre for Contemporary Women's Writing at the Institute of Modern Languages Research, London. This online seminar series for postgraduates and early career researchers seeks to explore how contemporary women's writing in particular, be this fiction, poetry, autobiographical or philosophical writing, is currently engaging with issues such as illness, disease, healthcare, medical practice, and clinical institutions. There are a wide range of themes being covered, and we are still accepting ongoing abstracts, so please feel free to send over any ideas that you have for future seminars. We started in September 2020, and we are continuing until March 2021 with fortnightly seminars, always on Tuesday evenings at 2:30 p.m. until 7 p.m. And this is our last one before the holidays, but we'll be back in January. So you can register for the seminars via the IMLR, via the IMLR website. We'll put the link in the chat, and so you can have a look at the upcoming seminars. So now for a few Zoom house rules. This session is being recorded so that it can be uploaded to the IMLR website and YouTube. So please feel free to turn your cameras on or off, whichever you feel most comfortable with. And we'll be having two 15-minute papers and then a Q&A session at the end. So if you could all remain on mute throughout the presentations until the Q&A session, this would be very much appreciated. During the Q&A, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the raise hand option on Zoom, and I will then ask you to unmute. The raise hand icon is found through clicking participants and then your own name, and there is an option to raise hand in the options. You may also want to type the word question into the chat box, and then we can come to you next. If you are not comfortable with voicing your own question, please write them in the chat box function at the bottom of the Zoom bar so that I can pose, or one of me and Becky can pose your questions to the speakers. Please feel free to add your questions to the chat as we're listening to the papers, or you can save them for afterwards. Okay, so we'll now be providing audio description for the seminars. So we will kindly ask all speakers to auto-describe themselves and any visuals in their presentations as much as possible. If you want auto-captioning, there is also a button at the bottom of the screen labeled CC, live transcript, which you can use to add auto-captions to this seminar. So I'll first just quickly audio describe myself. So I'm a 29-year-old white man with brown hair and a big brown beard and a nose piercing, and I'm wearing a navy shirt. And so now I'll pass over to Becky, who will introduce this week's seminar topic and our first speaker. Thanks very much, Becky.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so as Ben said, we've got two speakers tonight. So Mariana and Anna unfortunately can't make it, but we have Lise and Hannah here tonight to present. Before I kind of get into that, I'll just auto-describe myself as well. So 29-year-old, also Ben, white English British woman with kind of long fakish blonde hair and gold rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a blue shirt with kind of flowers and stuff on it. Anyway, right. So we have two speakers today, Lise and Hannah. The theme for this week, for the 7th seminar, is chronic illness and pain. To start off with, we'll have Lise Kronwald from Birkbeck University, London, who will be presenting a paper entitled "List Self-Accountancy and the Good Patient in Contemporary American Chronic Illness Memoir." So Lise is a Chase-funded PhD student in the Department for English, Theatre and Creative Writing at Birkbeck University of London. Last year, she co-organised the Birkbeck Institutes for the Humanities and Social Research Conference themed The Art of Not Doing. Her thesis focuses on the themes of work and productivity in contemporary Anglo-American illness writing about chronic illness. So we'll pass over to Lise now.
Thank you. I'll just see. Can you all see my slides? See, great, and you can hear me. Perfect. So I'm a 28-year-old white Danish woman with dark blonde hair and a white turtleneck jumper. I'm using a PowerPoint in this presentation, which has the quotes I refer to, as well as some abstract graphics just to make it all a little bit more lively. But I'm not describing these. I'll just say that they're made using watercolors and charcoal, and they're mostly in pinks and greens. Other than that, I don't have any illustrations or pictures. But there are some quotes on the slides I don't read out in full. So if anyone wants me to send them the full paper with all of the quotes, just please email me. I also want to say this is just a work in progress. It's a tiny strand from a very long chapter. So I'm happy to take any questions. And a little content note, there's quite a lot about medical treatments here, and it does get a little bit graphic at points. So I just want to say that. Good. So when I was ill with post-viral syndrome a few years ago, something that kept me mostly in bed for about a year, I had all of these lists. They lived in my head, continuously updated. Short lists of things that I managed to do, long lists of all of the things that I didn't. Lists of the strategies I'd try to get better, lists of everything that just didn't work. When I got a little better, I started to seek out contemporary texts about chronic physical illness, and I noticed that they had a lot of lists too. Lists of symptoms, lists of remedies other people had told them to try, homemade or real medical histories. In this short paper, I want to focus on just one kind of list, the kind I like to call look at everything I've done and to no avail list. Take this one. In a poem called Idiopathic Illness in Meccan O'Rourke's poetry collection Sun in Days, about living with a long-term infection. The poem is almost all list and describes the things the speakers tried in order to manage their as yet undiagnosed illness. The poem is addressed to the illness in the style of an apostrophe, a figure of speech that addresses something that is absent. And here it has the effect of personifying the mystery illness, evoking its presence even as its etiology eludes the speaker. Quote, I went for IV drips, mercury detoxes, cilantro smoothies. I pressed my lips to you, fed you kale, spooned down coconut oil. I fasted for blood sugar, underboomed the carbs, chased ketosis, urine stripped and slip checked, baked raw cocoa and mint and masticated pig thyroids. I read about you on the internet, and my doctor agreed. Just take more, he urged, and more, end quote. We can learn a lot of different things from a list like this one. First of all, this is in the US, and just this list alone shows us that the speaker is someone with access to a doctor who has the resources to try all of these different things. Going beyond the contents, there's also the function of the list. We typically use lists in our daily lives to keep track of things, to order them, to note them down for later. In literary lists like this one, there's often an illusion of order too. The first quoted line here is neatly structured. All of the actions are ordered by the verb went for. But already in the second quoted line, the order starts to break down. I pressed my lips to you isn't exactly a kind of medical strategy, and it disturbs the initial logic of inclusion. In the fifth line of the quotation, ampersands start replacing commas as a means of structuring the items, emphasizing an increasingly urgent repetition. This repetition culminates in the doctor's just take more and more. As a reader, we haven't been told what this might refer to. None of the items that are mentioned in the list can be taken. The omission of whatever the doctor's telling her to take suggests the presence of other omissions. This list is not about enumeration, but it's about the impossibility of including and articulating the speaker's full experiences. Umberto Eco describes this as the essential oscillation of the list as a form, a movement between the desire for the finite and the recognition that it is an illusion. The argument being made here is an argument by volume. The effect is disorientation, items piling on items, the exhaustion of trying one thing after another and them all failing. No matter how many things the speaker's already tried, the doctor's demand for the speaker to always do more puts the onus back on her. Lists like these are also often tedious. As much care as I put into my own lists when I was ill, as important as their details were to me then. As a reader, I want to skip them. But it's in that moment of being overwhelmed by the tedium of it all that I most recognize the experience of being ill. The abundance of detail and how it's connected to a need to legitimize oneself when one is ill is also apparent in a similar list in Abby Norman's memoir, Ask Me About My Uterus, about endometriosis. It's only after several years of debilitating illness, when the narrator Abby takes her boyfriend with her to the doctor, that she's finally taken seriously. This doctor's ultimately wrong diagnosis of vaginismus offsets a decade of different treatments described partly through a list. I tried, quote, I tried birth control, I got an IUD, I did pelvic floor physical therapy until it became too excruciating to continue. I have, in the name of pain management, had varied assortments of objects inserted into my vagina. Hands, garlic cloves, polished stone, colorful plastic expanders, slick transducers and isis speculums, catheters, swabs, scalpels, and gauze. I saw homeopaths and naturopaths and took all kinds of tinctures and pill pots. I lived in and for hot bath water. Just as in the previous list, we do not know who suggests which treatments. The subject in this paragraph is the first person. I tried, I got, I did, I took, I drank, I held, and finally, I lived, underscoring how these remedies have pervaded every aspect of her life. The list is, again, less about what the professionals she sees orders her to do, and more about her own compliance with these instructions. Lists are often instruments of discipline. The media historian Liam Young argues that in the lists we write, we can glimpse the techniques and technologies by which human societies administer, police, and imagine themselves. Abby, just as a speaker in O'Rourke's poem, is presenting evidence for her discipline and tenacity in trying to cure herself, or at least be part of it, perhaps to counter societal prejudice and discrimination, maybe the accusations of laziness, malingering, weakness, or even hysteria sometimes leveled at the chronically ill, and especially chronically ill women. As Philippe Lejeune has argued, both lists and life writing have their root in the fields of accounting and administration. Is it possible to write about your own life without, in some sense, passing judgment, evaluating your actions, or presenting evidence at least to specific conclusions of your own ultimate goodness or badness? Most kinds of life writing have an element of persuasion in them, and Rebecca Garden argues that the need for cultural validation plays a particularly prominent role in shaping illness narrative. Porchester Kakpour's memoir, Sick, problematizes ideas of the good, disciplined patient. I want to emphasize that, of course, there's no such thing as a good or bad patient, but certain behaviors are rewarded by the medical systems, as well as wider societies when you're ill, and others are discriminated against. And this also intersects, of course, with other forms of prejudice, bias, and inequality. That means that some people are seen in different ways than others, also in the medical system. Abby experiences this as a working class woman, and Porchester as a woman of color. Like Abby, Porchester, the narrator, describes having to take an active role in her illness. She repeatedly describes her illness as a full-time job, while she also has long lists of everything that she does right as a proactive patient. And there's an example of this on the slide, but I won't read it out because I feel like you've had enough of these long lists at this point. There's something different going on in this memoir. The interlude on being a bad sick person at the end of the text does something different also in list form. This interlude reiterates all of the points in the story when Porchester does what she isn't supposed to do as an ill person, even though these have actually been covered again, so they're just being repeated. Quote, with Lyme disease, certain diets are recommended. I rebel from all of these at some point. I ate bread, I ate sweets, I ate junk food and dairy, and I went further with toxins. I drank, I smoked, I even occasionally did drugs. By repeating these items, the narrator exposes how she's expected to perform to particular patterns of behavior to be seen as a responsible patient. And also in terms of people around her, as a kind of responsible worker citizen, doing her best to exit the sanctioned deviance of illness, which we always like to imagine as only temporary, as something you can work yourself out of. The interlude goes even further. Quote, "If you know a part of you is always dying, taking charge of that dying has a feeling of empowerment. People ask me for advice and I tell them to look elsewhere. I hate to exercise. I hate to meditate. I don't enjoy eating well. I never get proper sleep. I'm not a poster girl for wellness. I'm a sick girl. I know sickness. I live with it. In some ways, I keep myself sick." The use of the word empowerment here subverts its normal usage in this context. Many traditional illness memoirs, as Arthur Frank, for example, describes, follow a narrative of restitution or gain from illness, from the depths of illness to triumph by way of personal hard work, emphasizing that agency and empowerment can also be found outside following doctors' orders, indeed indirectly disobeying them, as well as outside of getting a cure. Kakpur rebels against her genre in some way. O'Rourke's poem ends with the speaker accepting that she can't control her illness. Norman's text ends with repetition. Abby becomes ill again with new symptoms, and again she's dismissed by the doctors she sees, suggesting an endless cycle of illnesses and attempts to get better. Sick likewise ends with repetition rather than restitution. The epilogue to Sick starts with the car crash that opened the story, before going on to comment on possible endings. Quote, "The book I sold. The book I sold was a story of triumph, of how a woman dove into the depths of addiction and illness and got well. She got herself better. She made it. The book I sold might even apply that you can do it too, or anyone can. Who knows? The book I sold was never written." Sick denounces the personal triumph narrative by repeatedly stressing failures of management and control when it comes to anything other than contributing to illness. The epilogue, which is structured as a list of unconnected events, ends by suggesting that the only possible ending is a non-ending. Quote, "The story didn't end as I imagined so many times. In the end, I would make it." End quote. Structure is often a key element in traditional readings of illness narrative. According to theories like Frank, who I cited earlier, and Rita Sharon, writing an illness memoir is a way to process the inherently chaotic experience of illness. Although Sharon's concept of narrative medicine is created as an alternative and complement to overly list-based medical practices as a way to see and treat patients more holistically, it still emphasizes structure as a means to an end. It's therapeutic for the patient to create a story out of their illness, a story with a start, middle, and an ending. And this helps them gain agency and a sense of control, these theorists argue. In recent years, however, other critics have pointed out that this self-contained, in-control subject that is the ideal project of the illness narrative, according to these theories, is a neoliberal subject, expert in governing themselves, eminently governable. Angela Woods, for example, argues for reading artworks about illness in ways that don't impose normative ideas about structure and closure. That's the thing about chronic illness. In reality, closure can be very hard to come by. At the end of O'Rourke's poem and Norman and Kakpur's books, they're all still ill. With this paper, I wanted to think about the ways that chronic, nonlinear, and kind of anti-coherent, disorienting experiences of illness are voiced in personal accounts of illness. In the works that I've highlighted here, the lists are central to doing this, with affordances to both ordering and disordering. The lists describe both the desire for control and the ultimate uncontrollability of illness and the body. These lists are moments in which the work entailed by illness is made visible. They reveal illness as the active state that it is, a continuous process and an exercise negotiating one's relationship to oneself, the sick role, and the expectations from society and medical professionals, as well as various forms of discrimination and inequality, as a narrative borderlands of sorts, where the contents of the illness narrative can be negotiated. what goes in and what doesn't, what's important enough to be elaborated in the text and what needs to be reduced to just a word. Lists can draw attention to the structures that are being upheld or negated, charting the individual text relationship to the genre of illness narratives as a whole. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for that paper, Lise. That was great, the way that you touched on 3 separate writers as well. That was brilliant. Thank you for that. We'll move straight on to Hannah, because we'll have for Q&A for both speakers right at the end. So Hannah Clarkson will be presenting a paper entitled "Where Does It Hurt? Writing the Ailing Body." So Hannah is a British artist, writer and researcher based in Sweden with a BFA in Fine Art from the Ruskin School of Art, Oxford University, and an MFA in Fine Art Craft from Konstfack, Stockholm. She has worked and exhibited internationally, including on a variety of site-specific projects relating to particular stories and/or places. She works with both sculpture and spoken word performance with an interest in narrativity and materiality as they relate to ideas of shelter and sickness. She is currently working on a practice-based research project at the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm, where she also teaches creative writing, investigating the synonym as a means to understand human needs. Recent publications include an anthology on quote, Decolonizing Architecture, a short story and poetry collection on shelter, the Green Room, Perspectives on Artistic Research, and the poem Your Hair Will Grow Back, a Poppy Field, in the American Journal of Anesthesiology. Sorry, that was embarrassing. Okay, she will soon take up a doctoral post at the RCA London in the Department of Arts and Humanities, and she also has a website, which I will link in the chat in a sec. So over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Becky. So I'll just describe myself briefly. So I'm a 29-year-old female with big gold-rimmed glasses and a pale face and messy, long red hair. I'm wearing a black and white stripy polo neck top. And yeah, I think just briefly to sort of, and I'll audio describe, so I'm going to show you a film, which I'll jump right into, I think, and then introduce it at the end, but I will also audio describe any images in that film after I've shown it to you. So yeah, I'm kind of doing this the wrong way around, doing my introduction at the end, but I will just jump straight into this, I think. Hopefully you will be able to hear this. Can everyone see my screen? Great.
Shield your eyes, my children. This is going to hurt. Shield your eyes, my children. This is going to hurt.
Okay, I'm gonna try this another way, I think. I have the file on my computer, sorry. I'll just stop sharing my screen. Second. Sorry about this. Okay, this should work now. I will just share my screen.
Shield your eyes, my children. This is going to hurt. A light so bright you can't see it. A dark so dark you might not even exist. You put on your evening glasses. Get ready for the even keel of night.
A wound gives off its own light, surgeons say. If all the lamps in the house were turned out, you could dress this wound by what shines from it.
What do we do with these wounds? When they cannot be seen, can we put them into words, make them heard instead? But what if the world doesn't want to listen?
Censor the body and you censor breath and speech at the same time. Write yourself. Your body must be heard.
Hélène told me to write my body. But where to begin?
A beginning is a cut in the onward flow of things. It is a lie too. We section out the story, slashing away what came before and after. A cut can form an opening, a hole or a door or a cave or a mine. But what kind of mine do we open? A landmine? Yes, a bomb.
My own body was a site of conflict, a battlefield colonised for years by invaders who had never even left home. Natives turned against their inherited land, attacked from the inside out. Stealthy at first, yet accelerating imperceptibly toward a denouement of destruction and eating away, slowly, of all their ancestors had over years striven to build. At the age of 24, I was growing backwards. I felt in my own body what Sinead wrote to me of hers.
Illness is an outpost, lunar, arctic, difficult to reach. The location of an unrelatable experience never fully understood by those lucky enough to avoid it. My teenage years were filled with hospitals and appointments, calendars circled with dates for surgery, the arrival of unfamiliar objects under skin. This malfunctioning version of me was a new, treasonous place. I did not know it. I did not speak its language. The sick body has its own narrative impulse. A scar is an opening, an invitation to ask, what happened? So we tell its story, or try to.
An autoimmune condition has been companion to my adolescence and adulthood since the age of 14. It makes me tired, a dull pain in my head each day until I cannot remember what it feels like when the fog is not there. I zone out sometimes into other planes when my body is not so heavy, not so weighted in its chair. Pins and needles. An attempt to mend, to stitch back together. But this is an embroidery which is taken too far, takes over the fabric of my skin and tangles my flesh, pierces pinpricks in muscles so they ache and twist and groan. These are pictures I never wanted, tattooed on my bones. At first, those first years, I ignored it, ignored the creeping fatigue that marked me out from the others, fought hard to pretend I could keep up, armor a disguise to fight the difference away. I always said yes when my body said no. Rest was not an option. Stopping meant defeat. I feared if I lay down, my limbs would not let me up again. Increasingly, so focused on my efforts to affect the energy of my peers, I forgot to eat. Fast forward the best part of a decade, and all of a sudden, I was shrinking. 15 kilos of flesh gnawed away until all that was left was tendons and marrow, and a brain smaller and slower than it was before, though more anxious, more constricted and controlled. A broken body and a mind conspiring to fight one another, to destroy themselves. An immune system turned in on itself, cells proliferating as their safe house crumbled, facade dulled, and organs struggled to power the corpus of home. Protection was attack and care a misplaced empathy, a kind weapon of metabolic malice and mournful mending.
The panic of altruism. Sadness rests inside the body, always, nascent like the inflammation of a chronic disease. Therefore, empathy is not a reaching outward. It is a loop, because there isn't any separation anymore between what you are and what you see.
But this was my body, and I wouldn't let it win.
Illness is the night side of life, another citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick. Although we all prefer to use only the good passport, sooner or later, each of us is obliged to emigrate, at least for a spell, to that other kingdom.
But what kind of territory is this? The terrain of one's own ailing body. Am I safe here? Am I alone? If sickness is a land we all share, then what language do we have to describe it? And how can we create a new, less damning vocabulary?
In order to use new words properly, you would have to invent a whole new language. And that, there no doubt we shall come to it, is not at the moment our business. Our business is to see what we can do with the old English language as it is. How can we combine the old words in new orders so that they survive, and so that they create beauty, so that they tell the truth? That is the question.
Another question. How can we tell stories when we are limited in our words?
Our history isn't important enough for men to write it down in ink. We take to needle and thread, sewing ourselves into the quilts for our daughters and sons, telling stories in the embroidery. When our histories are not safe to voice aloud, we ensure they are folded into the hems of skirts, sharp daggers tucked in hats. We will not go silently. We write our own history into legislation, into the Dáil, in poems and books, in music and art. Our stories keep us alive.
So if our words are not acknowledged, we have our bodies. If we cannot use our bodies, we always have words.
I thought of all the other invisible bodies with their fists up, tucked away and out of sight. If we take Hannah Arendt's definition of the political, which is still one of the most dominant in mainstream discourse, that any action that is performed in public is political, then we must contend with the implications of who that excludes. If being present in public is what is required to be political, then whole swaths of the population can be deemed apolitical, simply because they are not physically able to get their bodies into the street. In the Native American Cree language, the possessive noun and verb of a sentence are structured differently than in English. So in Cree, one does not say, "I am sick." Instead, one says, "The sickness has come to me." I love that.
Do we always get what's coming to us? Perhaps it's how we greet it that counts. The words ascribed to bodies can leave scars too. Or they can lift us out of our pain, marking the paper instead for the moments it takes to read or write them. There is recognition in the naming, as much as there is danger. How does sickness sit in the society in which the body dwells, a part of and apart? A reclaiming and an acceptance. Is this a working with or a striving against? What is the difference between caring for and protecting from? Living in and as and with this fierce, fragile body, what do I learn? I learn that I cannot do this alone, though only I can be it. I learn that empathy is not only a personality trait, but a learned action, born of experience. Not only a noun, but a verb. I learn that I am not superhuman, the shelter of my body not a given. I am not invincible. There must be new words to describe this otherness, which is not an otherness, but an experience, an onerous citizenship many people, in different mappings, in different bodies, have. I learn, I embody. I attempt with my words to re-citizen my body as a shared site which is my own.
Great, thanks for watching. I'll just briefly audio describe the images in there before I say anything else. So it was a combination of old medical textbook illustrations overlaid with my own line drawings that were made while I was in hospital 5 years ago. A man's hand wearing surgical gloves, demonstrating how to tie surgical knots on the laces of a pair of hiking boots. An old woman with walking sticks striding round around a children's playground. A hospital room with bed and flickering ceiling light. Framed photographs of my sister and I as small children. 2 dancers wearing masks made of sandpaper. A woman's mouth and chest slowly breathing. A dancer boxing, or a boxer dancing. A flea circus. A young woman holding, then hiding under, a sculpture resembling a tortoise shell for a shield. And I'm not going to say too much about the video, just maybe to introduce a little bit of kind of what it broadly is part of. So it was an experiment in trying to, so it began as a book, which I can show you. So it was kind of, book on writing the body, which includes some of the text that you saw in the video and some of the images. But it was kind of a way to try and use autofictions and poetry and intertextual reading to think about this idea of illness narratives and the language that we use around that and this kind of like battle cry, and whether that actually is the most helpful way of talking about sickness. And so I was kind of playing around with some of the texts that you heard in the video, with kind of reclaiming that language and questioning it at the same time through using it. And yeah, just thinking about what that means and what other words there are. And I guess also just thinking about this kind of choir of voices and thinking about this paper as almost like a conversation between myself and other women who've been writing about these things. So the form is very much an experiment. I'm interested to hear what you guys think about that. But yeah, so it kind of comes in tandem with the book, and which includes a lot more poetry in it and a lot more of my own writing, and the story about the Bronte sisters in isolation with TB and imagining how they might experience COVID-19 quarantine, and a short story about a young girl also with TB in South Africa. So it's a whole mix of just playing with different forms and different ways of writing the ailing body and writing through pain, and trying to find new words and new combinations of words for thinking about those things. Yeah, which I think that's all I'm going to say, actually. I think I'm going to open up to questions at this point, and think everything I wanted to put across is kind of in the video, whether that came across or not. But yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you for that, Hannah, and thank you for sharing the video as well. That was fantastic, and can already see kind of like links for some of Lisa's studies and research as well. We have time now, obviously lots of time for a Q&A. So does anybody have any questions? And remember, you can put them in the chat, and then Ben or I can read them out for you, or you can do the raise hand icon and. Oh, we've got a first one. There we go. So Jane Hartshorn, do you want to go for it?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, I'll just go ahead. It was just a question for Lisa. Hi, Lisa. I found it really interesting that you included a number of genres within your presentation, and I wondered if you think there is an ideal genre for housing this illness narrative or anti-narrative, or if you could, as an extension of that, maybe talk a bit more about the role that these different genres play within your thesis.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I started, I think the title that I sent to Ben and Becky said like in illness memoir, and then I actually changed it so it was like illness writing, because I also included the poem. And I do think I was kind of like interested in the list as a way for maybe even kind of the prose long book length prose text to even do something slightly like poetry in a way, and like Lisa's way of kind of breaking out of the narrative space and being a different kind of like container in the kind of like very narratively structured text. And so I think the poem in some ways captures it a lot better and like is a more natural genre in the sense of capturing maybe like a moment, but then at the same time, like this poem that I quoted did like a thing of like drawing, things from all over the time, like organizing the narrative in a different way by taking like all of these things that the speaker tried, but without imposing a chronology or any kind of like narrative onto them. And I think I find that quite interesting, of the way in which like the list can kind of like contain that kind of non-narrative, bringing together, ordering in a different way, or even like disordering the things in connection to each other. I think in my research and in my thesis, I do use quite a lot of different genres. And I've been like thinking a lot about whether that is a good idea or not. But I think I've come to the conclusion that because I'm looking at more thematic concerns of like work and productivity, and this paper was taken from a chapter on like patient work, I find it quite interesting to both have the poetry and the memoirs, and also I have like some manifestos and refer to like some video performance art, like lots of different stuff, because I do feel like the different genres do it really differently. But I also find it interesting how something like a list or like a small kind of sub-genre, sub-form can make comparisons between the different genres that otherwise do things really differently. I don't know if that answered it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane, for your question. We've got a question in the chat from Adina. Adina, do you want me to read it out for you, or would you like to go for it? Otherwise, I'll start reading unless you interrupt me. Okay. Oh, no. Just read it out. Okay, here we go. So this is from Adina, and it's for Hannah. I wonder if you could talk more about the relationship between the fragmented / slowed down movements of the video and the smoother narratives of the voiced over texts. Did you wish to express the tension between the body and text / narrative, as you said that when one body refuses to function properly, one still has words? I hope that this is somewhat clear.
Yeah, hopefully I've understood your question, but I guess, yeah, that kind of tension is important, and also just thinking about like different ways of using language, or maybe the image or the body as a language also, and a way of communicating. So I think like, yeah, trying to almost disrupt those kind of chronologies, like Lisa was saying, and yeah, just like thinking about the fragment and this realization that actually there are many ways that we can talk about this, and maybe it doesn't even have to make sense, I think. And I'm also quite interested in the idea of using autofictions, and so the bodies in those images, some of those are mine and some are not, and the same with the words and the voices, some are mine and some are not. So I think, yeah, it's this kind of, I guess when you come onto like the image or the use of writing to invoke empathy, and the way that we use narrative and storytelling to invoke empathy, and when we project ourselves into somebody else's, I guess, story, and they can hopefully do the same with ours. So I think that's a lot of what I'm kind of investigating, and I think I'm quite keen to keep that as like raw and fragmented as it needs to be, in a sense. I mean, I had another version of this video that was a lot more polished, and in the end decided that that didn't quite feel right. It was a lot more kind of, yeah, like beautifully edited, and that's not really kind of what I was trying to do, in a sense. So this is the first version that I made with a few tiny like tidy ups, but yeah, I hope that answers your question. I feel like I just rambled there, but
Thanks for that, Hannah and Adina. Marzia, do you want to see you with your hand up?
Yeah.
Do you want to go?
Yes, thank you. Thank you both for your presentation and the film as well. I was wondering if, Anna, you could say something, tell us more about this idea that empathy as a loop. What do you mean by that? Like, and what kind of thoughts are behind it? Thanks.
I guess, yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about empathy in the work that I've been doing in various ways, and thinking a lot about whether that's even possible, but still it's something that I'm totally occupied with, and I think we all strive for in various ways also. And so I think in terms of thinking about it as a loop, my understanding of that would be that it's, so those words were from Chris Kraus, those were not my words, but my understanding of that kind of idea is that it's something that we always bring it back to ourselves, like we're always seeing ourselves or inserting ourselves into other people's stories, and like in an attempt to understand, but also quite selfishly. And I think this is something I've kind of been grappling with in terms of like, maybe true empathy actually is about accepting that we're imperfect as well, and that we are kind of, always projecting ourselves into that, and then that realization, and it's kind of just this loop of constantly striving to understand and not necessarily being able to, but there's something there that we, even the smallest fragment of like somebody else's experience or something they felt there, like, can we grab onto that, and how do we express it? And giving for a better empathy, but also the futility of that, maybe.
Okay, thanks. Can I just like ask another, is more clarification. So can you remind me what it was opposed to? Because I remember like
empathy
not as something, but as a loop. What was the other one? If you,
I'm gonna find the quotation now.
Also later on, it's fine. I was just, because I see what you mean with your, like when you expanded a bit on it, because it seemed to me that loop was used as something more returning onto the person.
It was something to do with
feeling rather than the other is trying to feel with.
So it's not a reaching outward.
Yeah, exactly. So I was curious to be reminded of what was the other term. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great, thank you for your question, Marzia and Hannah. Are there any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. I'll try and see as best I can.
I've actually got a question
Catherine,
from
you could just put your camera on. Oh.
Ben, do you want to go first? I'll go after you.
Not at all. You go first, Catherine.
Thank you both for your presentations. I have a question that I think I'd like to hear from both of you, and how you feel that as well, because you both have this personal experience as well that's sort of then drawn you into looking at it from an academic, creative, sorry, words are failing me today, but actually that kind of ties into my question, which is how, and I was really interested, Lisa, in the memoir, and how it said that it's the book she sold never actually came to fruition, and you know, it's the things that she thought, the ending she thought she would have is not actually what's happened. And I wanted to ask about how language, and I suppose as well, Hannah, of yours, because it's sort of the visual element to your art as well, but particularly how language helps to give a sense of, I suppose, ownership over the condition, and how you mentioned, Lisa, that some of the texts that you didn't discuss today are manifestos, I think you used that word. So how, even with language that fails, how that's a way to try and kind of redefine the self when the self is undergoing this chronic illness that might not even have a diagnosis yet, like that Lisa you were talking about with one of your texts, I forget which one. Yeah, I hope that sort of is enough for you to talk about in response. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, I can start. Thank you so much for that question. And I think I feel like my own position in this is quite small. I was not ill for that long, but it was more like the way that I came onto these, like came to experience these texts and first got interested in them, and then it kind of took over from there, and I just realized that there were so many really, really interesting, amazing texts, and then I couldn't quite stop reading them and thinking about them. But I also agree in terms of wording and language, and I do think it can be a double-edged sword, in the sense that, for example, it was in the first poem of Idiopathic Illness, where the speaker's in a position of not quite knowing whether she knows she's ill, but no one can figure out what it is, and this is like where does it sit, and what, you know, what's the etiology, how, you know, everything kind of like is quite difficult, and partly stemming from a failure of kind of diagnosis as a tool. And of course, there isn't always a diagnosis, and there are all of these contested illnesses that so many people have, that professionals are still discussing. But also, in some sense, like diagnosis can also be difficult because it might not describe everything that you're feeling, and it might be really limited, it might be wrong. And so I agree that yes, and like language and the medical language as well can, in some instances, it can create ownership and agency and a sense of kind of understanding and detail. And then in some other cases, in some of the other books I'm looking at, the language is part of the confusion and in some ways the oppression of the medical language on the body, in ways that are also really interesting. So I kind of like, it's a question I'm really interested in, but every book that I read seems to say something slightly different about it, and that's also what's exciting. So it's definitely something that I'm following. And I'm really keen to hear Hannah's answer to this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I agree with everything you just said there. I think for me personally, like I was initially quite resistant to even including or even thinking about my own personal experience of illness in terms of my work. But then it came to a point where actually it was almost like everything that I was reading and everything I was looking at, everything I was making did come into that in some way. But I think in a sense, like words can feel, like Lisa said, like quite oppressive or quite like heavy in a sense. And I guess my resistance, I think, was to do with not wanting to write myself back into this sick body that was beginning to heal and still isn't there yet. Like, the story's not over, but it's, yeah, just not wanting to like write myself into this identity through my work of being sick. So I think in that sense, it is like, yeah, a double-edged sword. It's this kind of thing that, yeah, but then reading all these other amazing texts and looking at all this amazing art like on this topic, and actually like other people sharing those experiences and playing with language in such an amazing way, like I do think it's also really empowering and really important, because I think recognizing that resistance in myself was also this kind of like, oh, but should we really be talking about sickness, like this kind of shame almost. And I think that that's also why it's really important that like this work is done, like everyone who's given their presentations in the past few weeks as well. So I think, yeah, it also made me think about in relation to like the medical profession putting words on things and diagnosing. And in the Sinead Gleason book that I quoted from, there's an amazing chapter where she's looking at the McGill Pain Index and all the different words for pain that we're kind of provided with. And it was written by male doctors. And those are the words that we're given to describe our pain, sometimes for body parts that these doctors don't even have. So it's, and she goes through and she thinks about all of the pains that she's ever experienced. So from menstrual cramps to having a tooth pulled out to like waking up for an operation where she wasn't properly anesthetized. See, I'm struggling with that word as well. Yeah, and just goes through and tries to find new words for those things and to kind of own those experiences and that pain. So I think, yeah, in summary, I think words can be really heavy, but they're also like how we empathize and how we understand. So I think in that sense, it feels important. I've gone really far from your question, but
that was great. Thank you both for your responses. I think Ben's got his hand up, so I'll let him take the floor.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much to both of you for your presentations. I really enjoyed that. My question kind of comes off the back of Marzia's question about, there's going to be, I think this is a question to both of you as well, but in different ways. But Hannah, like about how you understand this idea of like the folding in on the self and this loop of empathy and stuff. And it made me think of ethics and kind of like, you know, in the kind of context of like, you know, a lot of ethical philosophy of ethics, and in the French context of philosophy of ethics, for example, in like Levinas and stuff like that, ethics is always about, you know, that other and the radical other, and it always has to be kind of like, you know, completely radically outside of yourself and nothing to do with yourself. I guess there'd be no like loop or whatever. It'd be completely non-dialectical, I guess. So like. And so how do you understand this kind of like this quote that you did about this loop, and how does that tie in with ethics? Like in this loop, is the person seeing their own body as other, or is it the complete opposite and it's like an ethics of sameness, or an ethics of the same to the same that is kind of completely incompatible with that ethics of the other type thing? And then I guess my question to Lise was like, how does ethics come into your project with the list, and how does the ethics of otherness come into the list? You were talking about the idea that you know, this idea of, is it possible to be completely detached from yourself in your writing? Are you always trying to, you know, like give you know, understand yourself better or give a certain side of yourself? Is there like a complete otherness that the list can like encourage or generate, or is it again about going into the self and kind of repeating mechanisms of the self, etc.?
Shall I go first, since you asked me first? I guess first of all, like thinking about this loop, and I think, and thinking about the body as other, I think my experience of the autoimmune thing has like made my relationship to that kind of like the body as other, like it's made it a bit more fuzzy in a sense. So like we often talk about ethics in terms of like caring for the other, and this kind of, which also kind of necessitates in a sense like that you're keeping something at a distance if you're like othering it. But then like what happens, this is something I'm really interested in, like what happens when it's your own body that is kind of othering itself, and what does that then by extension do to this ethics of care when like the body is kind of attacking itself from the inside out. And then like and then if it is this loop, then like we're kind of looking inwards for empathy at the same time as like that being kind of broken in a sense. So I think maybe there's a sense of like, I mean, this is tangled and complicated and I don't really have a straight answer, but I think maybe there's a sense of like letting those ethics be more tangled and letting things be looped and tied together, and these images like in the video kind of overlaid and voices responding to one another. So I think to let things be a little bit more like tangled and not just like from this like outsider perspective, and like, but then in the same sense like me kind of looking inwards at my own body and kind of that being an other. So it's complicated, I guess, is my answer. Like, but I think I feel it's necessary to kind of, for it to be like this other but not other at the same time, and for it to be fuzzy and messy. And and I know that like in terms of like research and PhD stuff, like that's not the answer that you're supposed to give. Like you're supposed to have this really like kind of, this is your ethics, but I don't really have a structured answer to that. And I guess fundamentally I don't really believe there is one, so that's where like I guess I come up against trouble sometimes, but I hope that answers your question in not answering your question.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, if I have to, I would say that also like touching partly on it and maybe not, tackling it head on. I think one of the things that really interests me with contemporary illness writing is the fact that it often kind of has a reader in mind or wants to do particular things. Like most of the texts, even if they're memoirs, so for example, the Abby Norman memoir is called a quest, like Ask Me About My Uterus, a quest to make doctors listen to women's pain, I think it is. But there's a very clear kind of, even like a reader implied in that. She wants to talk to doctors in a way to tell them a patient perspective. And I think lots of other texts, even if they don't kind of directly target, the medical profession or something, there's often like a degree of activism, there's a degree of, raising awareness is a kind of an old-fashioned way of doing it, but even in the way that Hannah was also doing with her film, like, creating a canon, bringing voices together. There's so often ways that kind of like, or methods, forms that imply kind of like a reader or someone to respond to it, someone to hear it, someone to listen to it. And I think in this paper, I was really interested in how these writers were relating to these kind of perceived readers that are so much easier kind of to see in the memoirs and the illness memoirs than in so many other kind of like kinds of literature and fiction, and even kind of more other kinds of life writing and memoir, which are often quite like enclosed and just like a meditation in some ways, whereas these are more kind of like targeted often. And how kind of the writers were relating to the perceived readers, but also, or implied readers, but also kind of in some ways like Kakpo is kind of like in some ways keeping the reader at bay a little bit and be like, don't get too close. Here's the pro and the con. You can make up your mind. I'm not going to, I'm going to give you all of the evidence. I'm not going to persuade you one way or another that I'm this kind or I'm like that. And some of the other, whereas Norman, for example, kind of lays out a very, very strong case from beginning to end, kind of like this is the right way to see things. And so in that sense, I guess there's like a relating to someone else, but I'm not entirely sure in terms of the ethics. I'm a little bit rusty on my Levinas. So let me know if there's more that I haven't addressed in your question.
That's great. Thanks very much.
I think Catherine has a question, if you'd like to say out loud or.
Yes, this actually leads really quite nicely from the point you were just making, Lisa, in response to Ben's question, but it was prompted by something, Hannah, you said in response to my earlier question. And actually, I wanted to talk about gender, given that, you know, it is the contemporary women's writing. And I wondered, well, there's sort of two sides to the question. Firstly, I wondered if you had chosen selectively from what you're working on, so your thesis and your broader work, Hannah, for today's seminar, and had only chosen work that looks at women's writing, or whether actually you have chosen to only focus on women's writing, so whether it's the works that you're exploring in your thesis, Lisa, or the sort of the voices that you choose to include in your own creative work, Hannah. And whether you, so that's sort of the first part, but whether you feel there's something unique to the female experience of chronic illness, and actually to add some, you know, as my own personal story, I have experienced over the years, I have mystery illness after mystery illness, and, you know, it's when I have had occasion where it's finally that I actually get a female GP, and then she's the one that takes me seriously. And I don't know how many others in the seminar today have had that experience, whether it is something which may or may not be related to female organs or not. And I was particularly interested, Lisa, in talk to me about my uterus. And I think you said that it was only when her boyfriend went with her that she was taken seriously. So yeah, if you could just possibly, Lisa, if you start off then talking about this idea of gender and being taken seriously by male or female doctors.
Yeah, in the Norman book, it's also her reading of the situation is that it's only when her boyfriend complains that she can't have sex with him that the doctor takes her seriously, which is quite something. But I think in my research, this was like a very small selection of the text I'm looking at. I'm looking at a lot of the authors that Hannah was also including in her video, so there's a lot of overlap. And I think, so in the way that I describe it in the thesis, I look at kind of like feminist illness writing rather than women's illness writing, because there are a couple of there's quite a few like non-binary writers, genderqueer writers, perhaps a man or two, I don't know, that has, we'll still see who I end up including, but they are all kind of like very informed by feminist thought and feminist theory and gender theory to a large degree as well. So that's kind of the selection criteria. And I think it's kind of it's not something that I've chosen, more than that it seems that those are the texts that are really interesting me, if that makes sense, the other way around, where I just feel like there's so much more contemporary illness writing being done by women and non-binary writers than there are by men. Maybe I'm looking the wrong places, but I think there's definitely something to do with also often, the more marginalized position and specific women's and kind of like illnesses to do with, uteruses and various things where they have been so kind of overlooked and misunderstood and under-researched that there's just such a need for voices that problematize that. But I'm really interested actually in reading more men's writing And I just don't seem to find it. I don't think there's as much of it, which is really interesting in itself. And I don't really have an explanation as to why.
Yeah, I think I would answer similarly. And I wonder if part of that kind of being more drawn to, to writing by women or by gender non-binary writers or by people who are more kind of on the margins, I think there is a sense of being more able to empathize with those positions. But yeah, that's me kind of trying to analyze like why it is that I'm drawn to those texts in particular. But because I was talking to my boyfriend about this the other day, and he was saying that like he would naturally then go for work by male writers. And so I wonder if it is partly about like just seeing yourself in those texts in some way. But I don't think it's as straightforward as that. And I had another thought there that I was gonna, and I think in terms of maybe like why there are more like there seem to be more like text illness narratives by women. I think I've been really interested recently in the Sinead Gleason text that I quoted from, and then the Erin Darcy, and so there are like all of these amazing. There's also Emily Pine, like had an amazing book, came out last year. There's all of these amazing books coming from Irish writers or writers working in Ireland that have just been published since the referendum on abortion in 2018. And like the Erin Darcy book is an anthology of stories that were initially published anonymously in a Facebook group where women were sharing their stories in order to, in this kind of really activist way, in order to sway the referendum. Like, and it was the first time actually in Ireland that women were free to talk about their bodies in that way. And like, and like I kind of I feel like maybe that was this kind of call to like, it's okay to talk about this, it's important to talk about this, like we should write our bodies in that sense. But I think also, so the Sinead Gleason book, I'm teaching a course on writing the body right now, and it's not only female students, it's a whole mix, and that's been really interesting in terms of like looking at this book from a woman in Ireland in a Swedish context and what that means, and just thinking about like what those discourses are and how we think about the body and sickness in these different places, and it's been really interesting also to get the male perspective from some of the students on that text also. So I think that's my response to that.
I'm actually interested also to hear like Becky and Ben, like why you chose to also curate this seminar series on specifically women and the medical humanities.
I can start, Ben, if you like, wherever you are. I think much like you three, Hannah, Lisa and Catherine, my own research looks at contemporary Francophone women's writing in context of mental illness, autofictions, and so a lot of the books that you've referenced I've read as kind of like a constellation. That's like a pun with Sinead Gleason, sorry, like a constellation of illness narratives. So Sinead Gleason, Anne Boyer, Joanna Hedver with Sick Woman Theory, just as kind of to get like a ground, or like a kind of like grounding in what's going on broadly, globally, I guess, in autofiction, memoirs, any kind of sort of illness narrative written by women, non-binary, and trans as well, just to kind of get an idea of kind of what's being done with the illness narrative form, particularly with like autofiction, which is, I have a big question about that, but I might leave it because I find this kind of tension between autopathography with this kind of like this is sort of slight tangent, that kind of like assumption of sincerity and veracity, and kind of, this is my like, you know, very sincere, like truthful, factual report of my illness. And you certainly get a lot of narratives like that, particularly cancer narratives, I find, are quite in that formulaic form. And autofiction, and how there's obviously a tension there with that, less of a obligation to be truthful or factual in a way, or to kind of like, and imagine a sick body partially in a way through autofiction. Anyway, that's a separate question. But in terms of kind of why we did this series, like reading all of these narratives and seeing so much exciting work coming out, particularly in like the feels like in the last sort of 5 years or so, couple of years, like you're saying, like the booming kind of like Irish writers as well. And it feels like there was something happening, and a lot of narratives coming out, and a lot of kind of, again, like, you know, reading these narratives and feeling finally like someone had put down on paper exactly like how I or friends had felt at certain points. And so it felt like it was a good moment, a valuable moment to try to bring together people who are writing about these authors or artists, and people, you know, like you, Hannah, as well, who are, you know, adding to that kind of like creative canon too. And again, and then also to turn to kind of like medical humanities, because it's such a, again, like a constellation of different kind of threads. It's sort of like a knot that is very much can be unpicked and kind of reworked into different ways. And so we thought that we would take it in this direction of looking women in like a very kind of like broad sense, like inclusive sense, like what's being done, because again, like it feels like there hasn't been a particular focus on women and the medical humanities. It doesn't. So we thought we'll see what happens, and then we get all of these like fantastic papers, and we have this massive seminar series, so it's great. So yeah, that's basically, I think we just saw lots of exciting work and wanted to see what people were writing about, really researching. Yeah, I don't know whether Ben wants to like crystallize that a bit better.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with all of that, and thanks for the question. I guess just personally, in terms of my PhD research, my PhD was about Catherine Malibu. So, and I was already involved in kind of women's philosophy of medicine, Malibu's philosophy of medicine, and well, not just medicine, but kind of like her philosophy of biology and of the body more broadly. And so I guess it kind of came out of that personal perspective, and then towards the end of my PhD, I was starting to think about Malibu is she a medical humanities philosopher, and what can her philosophy do for the medical humanities? So I guess that was kind of like the start of it for me. But then Lisa, as you were saying about the gendered element of kind of illness writing and narratives, all of the fantastic stuff that I'd read on illness writing was just happened to be from women writers, I guess. So already we just had such a huge amount of material to be explored in front of us. And I agree with you actually that I'm yet to come across much kind of men's illness writing, and so yeah, if anyone in the chat today has like some avenues to explore there, like I'd be very interested to hear about that. But yeah, I as well haven't really come across much. And I guess kind of historically, I think it's like a hugely transformative moment for feminist and queer theory at the moment. And certainly me and Becky like wanted to make this series to concentrate on a huge diversity of women's experiences and women's writing. Like it's a really scary moment for trans women, for example, at the moment. And so yeah, we thought that again this would be a way to participate in a very transformative feminist and queer moment, and also to hopefully showcase and platform like a huge variety of women's voices in medical humanities. So I guess yeah, those were the main reasons. Oh, thanks very much. I can see that Jane has put some suggestions for men's illness writing in the chat there. Thanks very much. I'll definitely check that out.
There's also Darkness Visible by William Styron. I don't know whether anyone's read that before. Put that in the chat.
Yeah, I guess I would maybe just add to that like a friend said to me the other day that he would almost be reluctant to write an illness narrative for fear, like, and this in a way just kind of, yeah, like reinforces like the power of this moment that we're in terms of like women's writing and queer and feminist perspectives. So in a way it's kind of like great, but I don't know, he was just saying like he would be afraid of it being received as like, oh, here's another man talking about his feelings in this like really David Foster Wallace kind of way. So I think, yeah, like maybe like, I mean, this is his theory and not mine, but like maybe this is why, like maybe it is just a sense of like, okay, like it's someone else's time and I'm too scared to interject for fear of it, yeah, being, yeah, I don't know really what I'm saying, but I think it could be part of just this moment that we're in, that actually there are all these voices that are emerging and finally are kind of louder than the others. I don't know how, like, what anyone else thinks about that, but I thought it was maybe an interesting point, like coming from like a genuine feeling, I think, on his part. So yeah.
I mean, I've just realised that I jumped over like a huge body of largely or often male illness writing, which was, of course, like AIDS writing. And Becky, I know that you did quite a lot of work on AIDS writing before, and you've written on AIDS writing before. Yeah, I mean, it's yes, no, it's interesting. I don't have like any answers to this. I guess I need to think about that a lot more.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, I suppose like, yeah, kind of like when anyone writes an autofiction or some sort of life writing, there is usually, not always, some sort of trauma, interruption, disruption, some sort of systemic, systemic kind of traumas going on that you want to write about for your sense of self and agency, but also like as for various reasons that Hannah and Lisa, you both discussed, as well as, other participants in the seminar and participants to come, like this sort of activist kind of these activist reasoning and testimonial reasoning as well, which is obviously, testimony theory wrapped up is sort of imbricated with illness narrative theory. And so I imagine, again, like, yeah, someone mentioned Derek Jarman, yeah, Modern Nature, and like, yeah, HIV AIDS writing, that kind of like boom from like the mid 80s onwards, really. Yeah, in French and in English, like there's a lot there. You could argue that people write about write about their illnesses when they have to, like when it's a life or death situation, when it's, for activist reasons, when they're trying to make change. And so one could, again, I don't want to generalize, but one could argue that there are more narratives by women or historically oppressed minorities, because, they have a greater need to write these narratives and to be listened to. I don't know, maybe cis hetero men don't have as much to complain about. I don't know. I don't want to assume anything. You could include I can't remember his name, which is terrible. Like reverse sexism. Not that you can really do that, but anyway, Robert Webb, that's his name. He wrote a book about kind of, I think, I haven't read it, so I can't attest to whether it's, any good, but he wrote a book about men's mental health and kind of toxic masculinity, I think. I don't know whether I'm misrepresenting it, but that would be an example of like a cis white man writing potentially about illness, but in a mental illness context. How to Be a Boy. It's really good. There we go. Catherine attests to it. Yeah. Anyway, we've gone a little bit.
Sorry, can I just add something I was starting to type? Not to be, well, yes, to make some generalizing statements, but sort of taking on this kind of point of the question of toxic masculinity. And this is, I don't know how if any studies really are done into this sort of thing, but my partner is a doctor, and sort of the general consensus of how gender plays into patients, and how, you know, there's this received notion that men don't go into hospital until it's something really, 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 really bad, right? And I wonder if it's to do with this idea of what masculinity is. And so I feel that when we're talking about, you know, I think it kind of plays into what we were saying about the oppressed, or the, you know, that if there is the male writing, I don't know the William Gee, William Styron and Derek Jarman, but whether they do have an element of being LGBT, or in some way not part of the powerful group, as it were. So, you know, with the AIDS writing, I imagine a lot of that was from men who were potentially from the gay community. But there is this idea that to be a man, so this is what Robert Webb talks about as well, you've got to just, you know, get on with it. You don't make a big fuss about how you're feeling. And maybe, Hannah, what your friend was talking about is that it's because this is now this time where we have these other groups that are coming forward, and it's sort of, you know, our time as the non-male, non-white, non-binary, you know, all of the others, as it were, to come forward, that, yeah, this idea of, can this toxic masculinity be addressed without being seen as taking over a spot that's already they've had? I don't know, that's very rambly. And also that was just a thought. There you go.
Yeah, just in response to that, I guess, like, maybe it's also about, like, using these voices, like, because I'm thinking about this book that was published by Grayson Perry a few years ago now, The Descent of Man, it was called, and he's kind of using his positionality, like, and his queer perspective, but, like, actually talking about toxic masculinity in a really accessible way. And, like, I made both my younger brothers read that book when it came out, and so I think maybe it's also about just sort of, if we're talking about empathy, then that applies to all of us. And I guess where we're trying to get to is the point where, like, actually we can all talk about our feelings and it's all, you know, but yeah, I think, yeah, in a sense it is maybe like about that kind of like speaking from the margins, in a sense, like, and yeah, sort of enabling people to come forward and use those voices, and like being an example for that also. But yeah, I think the Grayson Perry book is a really, really good on that topic also.
Yeah, thanks everybody for their comments. I just realised actually that I have a book on the floor that I'm reading for an illness narrative book club called This Book Mayflies by Andrew O'Hagan. It's not really an illness narrative per se, like an autofictional memoir, but it's a fiction, but there is a kind of, I'm not spoiling it, it's in the blurb, so it's fine, but there's a cancer narrative subtending kind of like the whole, the book. Yeah, part of the reason we're looking at male illness perspectives. Anyway, we can maybe come up with like a Goodreads group or a list and try and share ideas. And yeah, anyway, right. Well, thank you both Hannah and Lise for coming along tonight with your presentations and all of your wonderful questions and comments. It's been a really rich seminar. And thank you everyone for coming in again, like contributing wonderfully to the conversation. Just to kind of wrap up, I'm going to put some links in the chat. So firstly, you know, as Ben mentioned in the intro, this has been recorded. So this is the link to all of the event recordings for the IMLR. You can even see other seminars other than our own, but they're all going to be there. And if you would like to come to our next seminar, so this will be our 8th seminar on the 12th of January. It's going to be, I'll put, if you can register via this link, and again, you should, like, you know, see the promo on Twitter and mailing list, etc. But yeah, our 8th seminar on the 12th of January 2021, gosh, it will be guest chaired by Stephen Wilson from Queen's Belfast, and the title of it is End of Life Narratives, Resilience and Care. So if you'd like to come, please do come, register via the link, and yeah, thank you all. Yeah, I've seen a lot of names here that have been coming to the past couple of seminars, so thank you all for coming, and wish you all the best over the holidays.